It's a pleasure to welcome Tesca Fitzgerald here to UW for a talk. Tesca is actually interviewing for a postdoc position at the Robotics lab. So I've known Tesca, actually, she might not know this, but I saw her PhD application to Carnegie Mellon University many years ago, and was incredibly impressed. I think I saw a video of one of your talks at Google, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was a big proponent of Tesca from when she was ready to come to grad school. But then she decided to go to Georgia Tech instead, and has done some really fantastic work on HRI, really following the philosophy of what Andrea Tomas has done, and also intersecting with the philosophy of our lab of trying to find ways to formalize human-robot interaction in terms of strong mathematical models. And then now she's at Austin following Andrea and continues to do really amazing work. And now we'll hear her talk. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Sid, for the introduction. So I'm a computer science PhD candidate at Georgia Tech, working with my advisors, Dr. Ashok Goel at Georgia Tech and Dr. Andrea Tomas at UT Austin. I'll be talking about my dissertation work on human-guided task transfer for interactive robots. Now, before I get into task transfer, I want to talk first about the domain of interactive robots. Historically, we've seen robots being put in environments such as these, where they're really isolated from humans, oftentimes in separate workspaces or behind fences or cages, so that they really don't interact with humans at all. Not only this, but they're completing routine tasks where the same task can be executed over and over again. But what we really want to see is robots in interactive environments in our day-to-day lives. This involves several things. First of all, being interactive, so being able to work with humans, as well as handle novelty. Now, a key challenge of novelty is not just the fact that the robot has to adapt to new settings, but we also see that there are many sources of novelty, whether that's changes in the task goals, changes in the tools that the robot is using that affects the constraints of the task, unexpected changes in task dynamics that the robot has to account for, or different settings such as packaging on foods or objects that appear different in one environment or another. And so we want a robot to not just be able to adapt to novelty, but adapt to multiple sources of novelty while interacting with humans. So the key research question is, how should a robot address various sources of novelty? In my work, I tend to look at this as a robot learning a task in a source environment here, where the robot has been taught how to scoop pasta from one bowl to another. And then we want the robot to repeat a variation of that task in the target environment here, where here the bowls have been replaced and the robot needs to adapt to this change. There are several ways of addressing this. More broadly, since we use interaction with the teacher, the robot can learn tasks from demonstrations, such as here, where I'm moving the robot's arm to complete the task. So one might ask, why not just have the robot relearn the task in every various situation? And while demonstrations can be provided very quickly, it's infeasible to expect that the robot could receive a new demonstration for every variation of the task that it would receive, especially in multiple human environments. Another set of approaches involves having the robot generalize over multiple demonstrations of the task, where these demonstrations are in several environments in order to demonstrate some of that variation that the robot might encounter. But if we want robots to address novelty where a human might have not provided a demonstration that's similar enough, or the robot encounters novelty along a different dimension than that which was discovered or that which was demonstrated, such as changing the robot's tool that it's using or changing constraints in the task in a way that hasn't been demonstrated, then this approach might not work in those situations. So the area of research that my work is most closely related to is that of transfer learning, where we actually want to learn a transfer function or transfer method between two environments. And this is the area of work that my dissertation most closely addresses. So going back to a robot being in novel and interactive environments, a key question is, does the interactiveness of these environments hinder or actually help the robot? And in my work, I address this interactivity as an actual benefit to the robot, where the robot can use this interaction in order to address novelty. In my work, I first define a taxonomy of transfer problems, categorizing problems based off of the type of novelty experienced and relating that to similarity, abstraction, and methods for transfer. Based on this taxonomy, I've identified 3 categories of transfer problems, which I address through my research. And for each of these categories, I define in my work a level of abstraction at which the robot can transfer the task representation, a method of interaction for grounding that representation in the new environment, and algorithms for modeling and learning from the information obtained through that interaction. So to start first with the taxonomy of transfer problems, let's say that we have a robot learning a task in a source environment such as this. This is from an overhead view. Now, there's several different types of target environments that the robot might be expected to transfer this to, such as here we can see the objects are moved around, but the same objects are there that the robot is familiar with. A more difficult problem is that objects have been moved around and replaced, so this red bowl replaced with the black one, and we have a couple of objects that are not relevant to the task. A more difficult problem is where not only are objects replaced, but the robot also has a new tool. And by changing the tool, this affects the constraints of the task, or rather the robot has to follow the same underlying constraint, but doesn't know how to do it for this new tool. And finally, we can imagine a more dissimilar situation where the robot just can't transfer what it's learned to this environment. So we can see here that there is a spectrum of similarity between the source environment and the target environments where the robot would be expected to transfer the task. So here, I hypothesize that there's a relationship between the task similarity, the optimal abstraction of the task representation to enable transfer for these problems, and how the robot should ground the necessary information in the target environment. So here's an example task representation where this is typical of how a robot might learn a task. So we have a set of subscale models that might be an MDP or DMP for various steps of the task, which are parameterized for various objects so that the robot can target its action models to specific objects in the environment. Those object references are parameterized by the objects that are actually in the scene, which are parameterized by the robot's observation of the environment. So here we can see that this representation consists of multiple types of data at different levels of abstraction. So if the robot learns this full representation in the source environment, in order to address a category of problems such as this, where objects are moved around, but there are no other changes in the task, here the robot can very easily transfer to this environment by just grounding its observation or grounding the object references in the new positions of objects by observing the new environment. For a more difficult problem, the robot can continue to abstract this representation, and now that the object references no longer remain the same due to the introduction of a new object, in order for a robot to ground its representation in these problems, it needs to identify an object mapping between familiar objects and new objects in the environment. For this problem, we expect that the robot could still use the same underlying task models for the scooping task, but these have to be parameterized with respect to the new tool that the robot is using to meet the constraints of the task. So in an initial evaluation, we wanted to see what information is actually needed for the robot to address these different categories of problems. And so we tested 10 variations of each of these environment categories and applied these 3 levels of abstraction to each one of them. The abstracted objects or the abstracted data here was manually grounded. So we manually provided that information just to see what information does the robot need in order to address these various problems. We did this for all 3 categories. And what we find is that when the problem is simpler, such as objects being moved around but not replaced, the least abstracted representation is able to account for this problem. And as the transfer problem becomes more and more difficult, we need to use a more and more abstracted representation to address this. So this is fairly straightforward in that as we see more dissimilarity in the source and target environments, more information is needed to ground it in the target environment. And we see similar results with the secondary task, where objects are configured in a spatial relationship, whereas the problem becomes more more difficult, we need to further abstract the task representation. So this might indicate that why not just use the most abstracted representation in any of these tasks? If clearly that's the one that allows for the best performance across these multiple categories, why not just use that? Well, the problem is that as we further abstract the representation, the robot needs more information about the target environment in order to ground it. And so we see that there's an efficiency-generality trade-off, where the most general task representation also requires the most information about the target environment. So overall from this work, we find that similarity can indicate the level of abstraction for transfer, and that we do get this trade-off between generality and efficiency. And remember that for this evaluation, all the grounded knowledge was provided manually from a teacher. But in a realistic situation where a robot is encountering novel situations on its own, we don't want someone to have to hand provide this grounded information, which could be more technical in nature. So the problem then becomes, how does the robot obtain this grounded information on its own? And that leads me to my first piece of work addressing this categorization, particularly in the sense of object mapping, where I define a level of abstraction to enable transfer to object mapping problems, as well as a method of interaction and an algorithm for modeling and learning from the interaction data. So looking more broadly at the object mapping problem, let's say that a robot has learned a series of tasks in this environment at the left, just simple block placing tasks. And we want the robot to repeat that task in a very similar environment here, consisting of Lego blocks instead. Now, in order to transfer what the robot has learned to this new environment, we would expect it to come up with an object mapping similar to this, where larger objects map to other larger objects and smaller ones to smaller ones, so that if we stack these blocks, we're stacking them in roughly the same order from larger blocks to smaller ones. So while this is a valid mapping for this set of problems, let's say that in the context of another task, such as sorting objects by color or based off some other feature, then we now want the robot to identify a different object mapping that better reflects the constraints and goals of the task. So this is a very simple example of how object mapping in real-world tasks and objects is really a contextual problem, dependent on the goal of the task and the use of objects within that goal. What further complicates this problem is that if the robot is mapping n to n objects in the source and target environments respectively, then the problem space, or the number of possible mappings to consider, is n factorial, which very quickly complicates this, because if we're just mapping 7 objects, there are over 5,000 possible object mappings that could be considered. And if the robot doesn't know which feature to use to map these objects, then we have another dimension of difficulty here, where we can evaluate each of these n factorial mappings in n or m different ways. And this is because for a brand new task that the robot has learned, or a new environment in which the robot is unfamiliar with, it may not have a prior distribution of the relationship between the feature similarity or the feature to use for its similarity metric within the scope of that task. So this makes this an intractable problem without an appropriate similarity metric. So if we had this function delta that returned the similarity between 2 objects based off of an underlying feature that we know to be relevant to the task, then we could select the appropriate mapping that reflects this. So in my work, I use interaction to help the robot first prune the number of available mapping hypotheses from this large hypothesis space, as well as use the interaction to infer the relevant features underlying that mapping. So when I say interaction, the type of interaction being used is as follows, where the robot first receives a demonstration of the task, recording the objects being used throughout the task. And then when the robot is placed in a new environment, it first observes the objects there and receives assistance with the next step of the task. And what that means is that the teacher just indicates the next object for the robot to use, and from there, this builds a single correspondence between the object that the robot would have used in the source environment and the object that was just indicated by the teacher. Using this assistance, this algorithm predicts the remainder of the mapping, and this process can continue with the robot asking for assistance with the next step, then inferring from that, and so on, until the robot is confident enough to repeat the task in the new environment. In this work, I focused primarily on how the robot receives this assistance and how it uses it to predict the remainder of the mapping. So that demonstration or that interaction process looks like this, where we have a teacher provide a demonstration of the task, in this case an ordered task where we're stacking different cups. And then here at the bottom, the teacher gives assistance by either handing the robot an object or pointing at where it should go. And from there, it's recording the object that was used and which object it corresponded to in the original environment. So here, even though these cups look the same, they're actually different colors and different sizes as well. So if the robot had identified them or labeled them previously, that label no longer holds true in the second environment. So using each mapping hint or mapping assistance, that provides a single correspondence between a source object and a target object. So using this one piece of assistance, we prune the mapping hypothesis space to only those which reflect that correction or that assistance from the teacher. And then we also use this to evaluate our set of possible features that we record for each of the objects. Within this study, we considered seven different features, some of those perceptual in nature, such as the hue or size of an object, some of them derived, such as spatial configurations or changes in size or color, and others more knowledge-based, such as affordances and properties, which were derived from just looking it up in a table. But important to note is that this approach is not specific to just these features and is very flexible to feature additions. So after each assist from the teacher, we evaluate all combinations of features with all remaining mapping hypotheses, and the predicted mapping is the one that maximizes the similarity score across all correspondences in the mappings. And then this is continued until the robot has received enough assistance. We evaluated this in 3 different ways. The first evaluation being in simulation, and this is a more extensive evaluation to see, first of all, can we use this very limited type of assistance, really just pointing at objects or handing an object to the robot? Is that enough information for the robot to infer the relevant mapping? And if so, how much data is really needed? So for this evaluation, we performed 780 mapping evaluations over simulation using ground truth assistance. So basically from an oracle, so not looking yet at how a human might provide assistance.
Yeah. Quick clarification. Can you capture here ambivalence in ordering?
Yes, so we did look at that, and I'll show that in the results. Next, we looked at an interactive evaluation where we had a user study consisting of 10 participants. And we wanted to see how does assistance from real users affect this algorithm. And then finally, we completed a post-evaluation confidence analysis to see how much information does the robot really need to perform transfer, and how can the robot moderate its own interaction. So in our simulated evaluation, for this set of tasks, we considered 260 mapping problems. And we first compared it to a baseline of randomly selecting a mapping from the hypothesis set. So as you would expect, this does not perform very well, just because of the number of hypotheses that it could select from. But a more realistic baseline would be one where we use assistance to prune the hypothesis space, but not to infer the relevant feature for mapping. So when we do this, we definitely see better performance. But important to note is that the number of assists is directly related to the number of objects being mapped. So in this case, 5 objects are being mapped, and we can receive up to 4 assists before the full mapping is provided.
I was wondering what's the size of your hypothesis was?
Mm-hmm. So that depends on the number of objects. This is a 5-object case, so 5 factorial 120, I think. No, more than that, 500 and something. So this is for the 5-object space, and then we also performed the analysis over 6 and 7 objects as well. So this is the result when we use assistance just to reduce the hypothesis space. So we can see that once we provide 4 assists, then of course we get 100% correct mappings, because we basically hand provided the full mapping to the robot. The mapping by demonstration approach, we see significantly better performance, especially with fewer assists. So as data is more limited, it becomes especially important that we maximize how we use that data from the teacher. So using the interaction data not just to prune the hypothesis space, but also to infer which feature underlies that mapping. And here the confidence bounds are based off of variations of ordering of the different assists. So we see this continue to play out as we encounter more and more objects. So this was the 5 object set of tasks, and we also performed this over 6 and 7 objects. And what we can see is that as the number of objects increases, it becomes especially important to use that interaction well. And the mapping by demonstration approach quickly becomes the only viable solution in these cases for predicting the object mapping. So we then wanted to see how does this respond to real-world tasks with real users and so on. So we performed a user study involving 10 participants, which demonstrated 3 tasks each, all of them pick-and-place tasks. So stacking these cups, sorting these bowls, and packing a lunch. When providing assistance to the robot, we had our participants provide assistance for every step of the task. So here, this was primarily for data collection. We wanted to first see how users provided that interaction, and then later could go back and see how much of that interaction was actually necessary before the robot could predict the correct mapping on its own. We used a Wizard of Oz interface to record which object was indicated by the teacher. So this is the results from our interactive evaluation. And what we see is that for the stacking and the sorting task, here on the x-axis, this is the number of assists that were provided and the performance within that number of assists. So what we see is that at most 2 assists were needed for the stacking task to achieve 90% performance. For the sorting task, because this is a more difficult problem with 6 objects being mapped instead of 5, we see that 3 or fewer assists are needed before the robot can predict the rest of the mapping for 9 out of 10 cases. And then interestingly enough, for the lunch packing task, no assistance was actually needed for the robot to predict the mapping. So in some tasks such as this, this indicates a case where there was only one feature that consistently corresponded or that formed a consistent correspondence between objects in the source and the target. And so what this indicates is that for problems such as this, we want the robot to be able to identify that it doesn't need any assistance here and just use its highest ranking mapping without any assistance. So we can see that for the stacking task, if this is an 8-step task and the robot needs fewer than 2 assists for many of those cases, in practice, that would result to a robot needing assistance with the first quarter or less of the task, repeating the rest of the task autonomously because it now has the correct mapping for that task. For the sorting task, that would be within the first 50% of the task, and so on. Yeah?
So do the results in the first 2 tasks depend on the features that you had chosen a priori?
So there's we considered 7 different features. And so the 7 features that it considers are the same across all 3 tasks, but there is a different underlying feature for each of these tasks.
Right. So if you had maybe chosen a worse set of features, it may perform worse on those 2 tasks.
True, or if more features were considered, then it might result in better performance. But that's also dependent on whether a single feature really indicates the correct mapping. In some cases, that might be a combination. In our evaluation, we didn't find that to be true, but for some tasks that are more complicated, that could be the case. Yeah?
Does it start with a random mapping?
It starts with the highest predicted mapping based off of similarity across all features and all features and all mapping hypotheses. So the similarity metric that it uses is dependent on the possible range of each of those feature values defined for each feature. So it does have a prediction at the start, just based off of similarity across all of the features. But that's quickly changed once interaction is provided, and that prunes the hypothesis space. So looking more into the cases where we saw good performance without any assistance, we can see that some mapping problems can be addressed without any assistance. So here on the x-axis, this is the number of assists that were provided, and here the performance at each of those assistance levels, defined over the 3 tasks, so sorting, lunch packing, and stacking. So we can see for the lunch packing task, we get perfect performance without any assistance. And for some other tasks and other variations of those tasks, we see that performance greatly improves after receiving some assistance. So this is particularly the sorting task, which had the most objects to the largest hypothesis space to be pruned. But interestingly enough, we also see that beyond a certain point, performance may actually decrease with additional assistance. And this is because of the nature of interaction, and the data retrieved from that interaction is that it can become noisy or error prone, especially as we ask for more assistance. So when we're having the robot leverage such little assistance, it becomes very important that that data is error-free. And in this case, that error could result from the robot and the teacher having a different understanding of the task, or perception errors with the robot misidentifying which object it would have used first, and so on. So what this indicates is that we really want to be able to have the robot moderate its own interaction to decide just how much interaction is needed. This is helpful for two reasons. By limiting the amount of interaction that the robot receives, first of all, that makes the robot more autonomous. So we want the robot to only ask for the minimum information that it needs, as well as reduces opportunity for error brought on by additional interaction. But we also need enough assistance that the robot can use this information to predict the mapping. So we looked at a confidence threshold where confidence was defined as the margin between the top two mapping hypotheses. So as this margin increases, our confidence in the top ranked mapping also increases. And what we find is that as we increase the confidence threshold, that in turn increases the number of assists requested by the robot. The problem then is, how do we identify a threshold that both minimizes this assistance while also maximizing performance? And we found that for these three tasks, there actually was a single threshold that resulted in minimizing assistance while also maximizing performance across all three tasks. So more evaluation would be needed to see how this threshold is dependent on various features of the task. But it was exciting to see that a consistent threshold could be applied in all these cases to maximize our results. So using this confidence-guided approach, we found that within the user study data, correct mapping was identified in over 93% of mapping problems. More broadly, looking at the benefit of this, we can see if we compare the autonomy of the robot, which is the average number of steps needed where the robot needs assistance before completing the rest of the task. We see that if we really wanted to maximize the robot's autonomy, we would have the robot use an unguided approach, just using the mapping predicted without any assistance. And while in some cases, such as the lunch packing task, that does work, we see that there's a lot of variance across tasks. If we cared about the robot receiving the correct mapping in every case, so maybe in an industrial setting and so on, we really want the robot to just be re-demonstrated in that specific environment. But this also leaves the robot with no autonomy. So using a confidence-guided approach allows us to balance these two and maximize the combination of them, reducing the number of assists needed while also maximizing its performance. So overall, what we find from this evaluation is that inferring the relevant object features for mapping is important, especially as the problem space increases. We also see that by situating this mapping in interaction with the human teacher, the robot can leverage this interaction to infer the correct mapping between 1 and 3 assists in our user study tasks. And in our follow-up evaluation, we find that assistance, while it's helpful to provide context to the task and important information about grounding the task in that specific environment, we also see that it can introduce opportunity for error and thus must be moderated by the robot. And that using a confidence threshold informs the robot's decision as to whether it should request more information or not, allowing it to maximize its performance. So in this category of problems, object mapping, we do make the assumption that when an object is replaced, it doesn't affect the robot's manipulation of those objects. Which is certainly true for a category of tasks, but now looking into a different category, those where objects that are replaced actually affect the robot's manipulation, such as in tool-based tasks. More specifically, if we teach the robot a task for sweeping objects off of a surface like this, we might provide a demonstration with this paintbrush, and then later we want the robot to repeat the task with a short brush. It's a little hard to see in this image. But because these are the same tasks, sweeping, we would hope to use the same underlying task models in both of these environments, but just make the necessary changes based off of the replaced tools. This becomes especially challenging because it's not enough for the robot to just know that there's a different tool being used, because objects have different tool tips, and that depending on the task being performed, those tool tips are used in a different way. So for a brush, we care about the brush surface being the relevant tooltip, same here. And so while the same constraint is being met with the different tooltips, the robot doesn't know the exact relationship between its end effector and the tooltip, especially within the context of this task. So the robot can receive a demonstration with the original tool, such as using a hammer to pull a box closer to the robot. And in this set of work, we use keyframes, in which the teacher moves the robot's gripper to a certain position, records that pose, moves it to another, records that pose, and so on. And the reason we do this is that humans tend to center those keyframes around constraints of the task. So this, first of all, highlights different constraints of the task, where a change in tool would affect those constraints directly. And then later on, that also allows the robot to attempt to repeat those same keyframes with a new tool. So here we use corrections rather than redemonstration with the new tool, because by having the teacher correct the robot's pose, we're recording the minimum distance necessary to adapt to the new tool. Versus if we had the teacher just redemonstrate with the new tool, we can't record which of those changes in the demonstration were actually due to the tool being changed. So by using keyframes and corrections, that allows us to directly compare the pose at this keyframe using the first tool with the pose at the same keyframe with a different tool. And we can collect one of these correspondences for each step of the task. So if the robot has received a demonstration of sweeping with this paintbrush, when the robot repeats what it's learned from the demonstration, there we go. That results in a trajectory like this. If we want the robot to repeat this task with a replacement tool, we provide corrections by moving the robot's gripper to the correct pose if it were to complete this task with a new tool. Now notice we're using a mug to sweep instead of a paintbrush. And that was intentional because we want to see how could a robot use a creative tool replacement in order to improvise in a new environment. So for example, if like when I was moving into a new apartment, I couldn't find my hammer, but I could find a rock or a shoe. You know, these are various replacements that humans are able to make. And if we want to allow robots to do that as well, we need to consider how might a tool be used in an atypical usage for a new task. So here, by providing these corrections and moving the robot's gripper to the correct pose for each keyframe, we're recording a set of pose differences, specifically one for each keyframe of the task. So if we collected k keyframes, it gives us a k/2 corrections matrix that we can then derive a typical pose transformation between the first tool and the second tool. So our goal here is to take the set of corrections from this corrections matrix and identify a typical transformation that minimizes the distance between the corrected pose and the transformed original pose that the robot used for the first tool. Now, a complicating factor here is that corrections and where the teacher moves the robot's gripper to is subject to the constraints of the task. So here at the left, a teacher could move the robot's pose to any one of these positions if the goal is just to put the paintbrush into the box. So here we can see that the orientation of these different tools is roughly the same. So the orientation is more constrained here rather than the actual position of the brush. And here at the right, we see a set of other valid poses where the same constraint is being met, which is the brush touching the surface that it's supposed to sweep. But we have multiple orientations and positions that are all valid for achieving the same goal. So when we provide corrections, we have to filter out, or we have to model them with respect to these different types of constraints to see, in order to identify a typical transformation for that pose. So getting more into how we model these constraints, for a task where the orientation of the tool is more constrained, we can see here how that's represented in the correction data. So each of these arrows represents the change in X position and change in Y position, with the direction of the arrow indicating the change in orientation. So this is a 2D simplified version of a set of corrections. So we can see these arrows highlighted in blue follow an almost linear relationship between the x and y pose, and so we see more variance along this dimension. But in terms of their orientation, they're all roughly the same change in orientation for the new tool. We also see a couple of these arrows in the middle, these black ones, where they're both centered around 0, 0 and pointing at 0 degrees. And these are points in the trajectory where no correction was provided. So even though keyframes are typically centered around constraints of the task, not all poses are really constrained. So as the robot reaches toward an object, it's harder to tell if the robot should be corrected at that point, and so no correction might be given. Whereas as the robot moves closer to the target object or enters a more constrained part of the task, those corrections become more defined. So we ideally want to filter out unconstrained points such as these, while also maintaining the relationship between x, y, and orientation indicated by these corrections. For a second type of constraint, we can see here that the end effector almost pivots around the tooltip here. And we see a similar relationship in our correction data, where the direction of each of these arrows almost seems to be pointing toward a center of rotation defined by the tooltip. And so we want to be able to estimate what that center of rotation is and also filter out uncorrected points. So we model this in two ways, where the goal of these models is to produce a typical transformation by later allowing us to sample that model of the corrections. So for a linear transformation, we use ransack to first filter out these uncorrected points, while also estimating the parameters for our constraint model. In this case, for a linear relationship, we use an error function that reflects the distance between each correction from the linear relationship, as well as the change in orientation, with the goal being to minimize the reconstruction error over each correction in the sample for each round of ransack. This model is based off of PCA, where we use PCA during the ransack process to identify a one-dimensional space that best represents these corrections. Once we have found the optimal parameters for this model, we then sample it based off of the average pose in one-dimensional space, projected back into 3D space, and sample an orientation that most closely matches those in the unfiltered or filtered set of corrections. For our second model, we define a rotational transformation model, where the goal here is to identify that center of rotation around which our corrections are orbiting. And to do that, we also use ransack to estimate those parameters while also filtering out outliers such as these. So we use ransack with the error function based off of the distance, or the change in distance between the corrections and the average radius from the center of rotation. And that allows us to minimize the distance of each sample correction from the center of rotation. Once we've identified the optimal parameters for this model, we sample a transformation based off of the projected average distance away from the center of rotation, projected back into 3D space, and sample the orientation that points toward that center of rotation. We also use a third model, which is really more of a best fit selection of either the linear or rotational transformation models, where here we select the model that results in the smallest range of correction values within the projected space for each model. So for the linear transformation space, that would be the smallest range of correction values within the 1D PCA space. And for the rotational model, that's the smallest range of values within the orientation space with respect to the center of rotation. In our evaluation, we provided the robot with 3 keyframe-based tasks using multiple tools. So those being hammering at the top, sweeping, and hooking a box closer to the robot. So here we can see that all 3 of these tasks were demonstrated with the hammer, which in some cases involves a more canonical task, such as hammering with a hammer, versus more creative repurposing, such as sweeping objects off a surface using a hammer. And we provided, oh yes?
So is the claim that those three models are expressive enough to encode any tasks that you might care about with the tool?
So in our evaluation, we did want to see were those two models enough to represent the constraints. And in our evaluation, we found that yes, those two were enough, or rather the best fit between the two, which I'll cover in a moment. I would expect that there are other constraints that could be modeled in addition to this, but at least within the tasks that we tested, those were sufficient. So we demonstrated all three tasks with three different tools, those being a hammer, a paintbrush, and a small wrench. And the goal was to transfer those task models to two target tools, a short brush and a mug. So at the top, we can see this is a replaying of the task model learned for the paintbrush. And after receiving corrections with the mug here, using that task model learned with the brush, we can see that successful transfer occurs when we transform the trajectory to the new tool, using the corrections learned in this task for this tool. Our results indicate that, first of all, as a baseline, when we do not learn any transformation and we just use the original untransformed trajectory, this doesn't work, except for a couple of outlier points. Using the linear model, we see much better performance, especially average performance, both when transferring to the brush and to the mug. But we do see a lot of variation here, meaning that while a linear model was appropriate for some tasks, maybe even many, there were lots of tasks that, where this model was not sufficient to represent the constraints. The rotational model, we see similarly that for the brush, this seemed to be the more appropriate model in many cases, whereas we see slightly worse performance for the mug as compared to the linear model. And so this is where a best fit approach becomes very important. We basically want to select the best constraint model for a particular task and use that one. So when we select the best fitting model, we see the best performance in either of these two tools. So that was all. And then we also evaluated this for several thresholds. So thresholds measuring the percent of maximum performance for each tool. So for a sweeping task, that was based off of the number of objects that could be swept from the surface. For the hooking task, it has to do with how closely the box is pulled toward the robot, and so on. And so we can see that as we lower the threshold, we get more and more transfer executions that met that threshold. But importantly, for our two highest thresholds, 95 and 85% of maximum task performance, we see that using these corrections allows the robot to achieve that threshold in 61% or 72% respectively. So we see much better performance when we use these corrections to address the majority of transfer problems, especially as compared to an untransformed method, which performed well in very few cases. So that was all what we call within task transfer. So using the corrections obtained on one task just within that same task for that same tool that was just corrected. But we wanted to see how well do these transformations apply to other tools or other tasks using the same tool. So for example, using the correction model that was just learned in the sweeping task, can we apply that to the hooking task as well and get good performance? Basically, does this transformation adequately represent the change in general between the paintbrush and the mug? And so for a task that looks like this at the top, there we go. So given a task model for hooking the box closer to the robot, can we use the same correction from the sweeping task to repeat that with the box? And so we found that, so this example shows a case where this was successful in generalizing. Of course, this is a case where we didn't actually provide any corrections specifically for this combination of tool and task. So we never demonstrated how to hook the box with the mug. We never corrected it for this combination and so on. So this is a freebie basically from the corrections that the robot had seen earlier for a different task. Now, looking more carefully at these results, we see that with each of these dots indicating one transfer execution, we see that performance for across task transfer is not as good as it was for within task transfer. But we do see that there's a lot of cases, or several cases, where we are able to leverage the corrections obtained on an entirely different task in order to perform transfer without any additional interaction from the teacher. And so overall, we see that transfer was improved in over 27% of problems, again, without any additional training. But this also raises the question, how do we tell if transfer is going to be successful? Under what conditions is it successful? So we need to look more at the relationship between tasks, tools, and tooltips. Specifically, if we've learned how to use a paintbrush for sweeping as well as for hammering, for these two tasks, even though they're the same tool, we use two different surfaces of the tool, which we refer to as the tooltip. So whether that's the brush surface or the side surface for the hammering task. When we provide corrections, we're essentially providing samples of this transformation between using the paintbrush for a sweeping task and using a smaller brush. And so what across-task transfer is trying to do is reuse the transformation learned here in place of this transformation here. So assuming that these two transforms are the same, in order to transfer the hammering tool here to the hammering task here to the hammering task with this brush. So in cases where this generalization is possible, that's because there's an analogical relationship between the tooltips being used across these different tasks. And what we found was that when we limited the data set to just transfer situations where this analogical relationship held, we found that transfer was improved in 41% of these problems, where the tooltips were used in a similar manner. So essentially, we have to look very carefully at this relationship, contextual relationship between tasks, tools, and tooltips. So overall from this work, we learned that linear and rotational models, as presented here, represent different types of constraints and tasks. And for our within-task evaluation, we found that this was sufficient for successful task completion in 72% of transfer problems. For across-task evaluations, where again we're evaluating how well do these models generalize to new tasks without any additional data or interaction or training, we see that this success is dependent on the role of the tool within the task. And that when there's a similar relationship between tooltips in different tasks, that's when that model can be generalized. So very briefly, I want to talk about the last category of work, which is actually ongoing work. In this category of problems, I wanted to see how can the robot actually learn to generalize to new tools. So in the previous work that I just discussed, this presents a scenario like this, where we have 3 different tasks and 2 different tools. We basically want to see if we demonstrate these 3 tasks with one tool, we provide corrections for a second tool, can we then generalize that to the other tasks that were demonstrated? So that's what the previous work had focused on. In my ongoing work, I'm looking at how a robot can continue to generalize from corrections in order to predict the transformation to a new, previously unseen tool. So in my ongoing work, I'm looking at how this relates to meta-learning, specifically how do we learn the relationship between task parameters and tool features, and whether we can use an active learning approach to improve meta-learning for task parameters. So rather than just use meta-learning to identify the optimal initial weights for a task, can we also use this process to learn an effective information gain metric so that the robot can request specific tools to help it further improve its model? And that would be very dependent on, again, the tooltips that are being used and the context of the task being performed. So this is all my ongoing work. I'd love to talk more in detail if anyone is interested. And so to summarize, I first looked at a taxonomy of transfer problems, linking task similarity to representation and grounding. And then using this categorization of problems, I've identified a mapping by demonstration algorithm to allow a robot to infer the object mapping from minimal assistance from teachers. I've also identified a transfer by correction approach to allow a robot to quickly adapt to using new tools. And in my ongoing work, I'm learning, ongoing work in learning how a robot can predict constraints for new tools using active learning approaches. And with that, I'd like to thank my many collaborators, as well as our funding sponsors. And I'm happy to take questions.
So in the transfer by correction component, did you find that the methods were robust to tool slippage or like the tool changing orientation throughout the
That's
task?
a good question. In this problem, we had the robot gripping the tool at the start of the task. So we didn't address at all how the robot picks up the tool. That would add a very different dimension to the problem. And there is work on identifying grasps that are relevant to specific tools. But yeah, that's not part of the work that we addressed. I imagine that it would affect the results. And so in this work, we didn't use any aspects of visual features of the tool because we wanted to see what can we get from just corrections alone. But I expect that if the robot were to grasp the tool as well, you could integrate the visual features of the tool with, and specifically visual feedback on where the robot grasped the tool with its transformation.
Right. So the corrections that you got were they were corresponded to like how do you put the mug in the robot's hand.
Right,
correct?
right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so there's almost a different transformation depending on the grasp, which, here we looked at how one tool can have multiple tool tips, but there's a separate problem of one tool can have many different grasps. And so, yeah, that's a very interesting direction of work. Yeah.
Yeah, so you used visual features in the first part as a heuristic for speeding up your pruning. And I was curious if there was any effort to use it also in a way to aid the mapping. For example, if I know the size of the objects, then that can speed up my search for that can improve the search of where I'm going to map cell phone versus water bottle.
Yeah, so exactly. That's where assistance is used in two ways. One, to prune the hypothesis space, as well as to infer that underlying feature. And so once that underlying feature can be determined, that's when we see an increase in confidence, which allows a more efficient use of interaction because the robot can then stop asking for assistance.
So, but I'm curious if there was any effort to use that in the tool transfer domain.
Oh, in the tool transfer domain. Right, right. In this case, we didn't, again, because we wanted to see how corrections could be used without, aside from visual input, so using just interactive input. What I expect would be the most effective speed up of this approach would be using vision to identify candidate tooltips, and then using the corrections to inform which of those tooltips is most probably likely. So not using the features in the same way as what you're saying, but visual features could definitely play a role in that work.
Any other questions? Cool. Thank you.
All right.